Welcome to Hiring to Firing, the podcast. I'm Tracey Diamond, labor and employment attorney at Troutman Pepper, and I'm here with my co-host, Evan Gibbs, also a labor and employment attorney at Troutman Pepper, and together we tackle all employment issues from hiring to firing. Today, we're very excited to have Amy Bashore, Assistant General Counsel at Exelon Business Services Company. Amy, why don't you tell us a bit about Exelon and your role there?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Before I do that, I'm very excited to be here. Always great to work with you guys. So it's fun to do something outside the work context. Also very excited that you picked Julie and Julia. I loved the movie when it came out, and I ran right out and bought Mastering the Art of French Cooking by Julia Child. Unlike Julie Powell, I cooked exactly 0 recipes out of it after I opened it up.
No boeuf bourguignon or
No boeuf bourguignon.
deboning a duck for you, huh?
No, not even oof. I cook them in a, just fry them in a pan like every American, I suppose. But it was great to revisit that as well. And maybe I'll crack the book open. But if you are going to cook, Exelon is a great company for you. So Exelon is an umbrella of 6 different utilities, electric and gas utilities. And so we will keep the electric running to your stove, the gas running to your stove, or keep the lights on and the electricity running for a podcast like this. So we have ComEd, a utility in Illinois. We've got PECO here in Philadelphia, where Tracey and I are. We have BGE down in the Maryland area. We have PEPCO in DC, ACE in New Jersey, and Delmarva in that Delmarva region. And I am, as you said, an assistant general counsel. I focus primarily on employment issues, although I dabble a little bit in the labor space as well.
Terrific. We're thrilled to have you here, Amy, and we're really excited about today's topic. Evan, you want to kick us off?
For sure. Yeah. And speaking of gas stoves and all of that, we have a gas stove at my house, and I actually cook a lot. And so I can appreciate the energy that we get for that gas stove. It's so much better to cook on than the electric stove. But anyway, as an aside,
I have an electric stove, and it's not as good for sure.
yeah, it takes so long to heat stuff up, it seems like. Yeah,
so
but
true.
the gas stove is really, I found superior for cooking. And that's what I heard before we got it. And I can confirm that it is true, which is certainly, I think, apropos for our topic. Today, really, the substantive topic we're talking about are the benefits and problems with allowing employees to moonlight from their, primary careers. So as always, as Amy mentioned, we use a popular movie or TV show to illustrate the issues. And so today we've picked the film from back in 2009, Julie and Julia, starring Meryl Streep, Amy Adams, Stanley Tucci, and some other folks as well. And if you haven't seen it, it follows the trials and tribulations, we'll say, of Julie Powell, who was a young New York City government employee as she struggled with her day job, and she was struggling with a challenge that she gave herself to cook all 524 recipes in Julia Child's cookbook titled Mastering the Art of French Cooking, and then to blog about every recipe that she cooked. So a bit of a daunting challenge, to say the least. So I think that is a good spot to listen to our first clip.
The challenge? 365 days, 524 recipes. The contender, Julie Powell. Government employee by day, renegade foodie by night, risking her marriage, her job, and her cat's well-being, she has signed on for a deranged assignment. How far it will go, no one can say.
The movie parallels Julia Child and how she came to be Julia Child with Julie Powell's, more modern day struggles with the day job and the blogging. And as a fellow blogger, I never tried to actually do the cooking part because nobody really wants that to happen in my family. But the blogging part I can relate to. But I think in general, this idea of moonlighting, it doesn't necessarily have to be moonlighting at a job, but just moonlighting meaning any other gig or side gig that an employee has. What are some reasons, do you think, why employees may want to moonlight?
Well, I think the movie itself illustrates several. I mean, at a very basic level, she just really loved cooking. Like, people have some passions and they're getting more into them, and things like the internet and Etsy makes it easier to do all that. Everyone on my block, I think, has a quote, side hustle going, in addition to their job, and it's all things they like to do. I think that might be one of the reasons people moonlight, is that they just have something they're really passionate about outside of work that you can do a little bit more than just a hobby now these days.
One of my friends is from Denver, and he says that in Colorado, when asked, what do you do, people will say skiing, snowboarding, skateboarding, what have you. And in the Northeast, when you ask, what do you do, people say accounting, attorney, doctor, whatever their career is. And it's that sort of different mentality of, living to work versus working to live. I also think there's some generational differences there where I'm seeing kids that are starting out in the workforce, or even if they're coming into jobs that they really love and are interested in, they're really doing the job to fund their personal lives versus the older generation, not so old, but just older generation, where I think the mentality is more that you're living to work, that the work is such a big part of your persona. I think that's really interesting when it comes to moonlighting.
I've heard too, of the reverse situation sometimes. You have folks who may be doing a job that they love by day. I mean, it could be something that's a really low paying job. I've heard of part time librarians, if people work at a library or maybe work at a nonprofit and they're doing what they love during the day, but it doesn't quite pay the bills. And so maybe they start moonlighting, whether it's doing something in the gig space, in one of the apps, or like Amy mentioned, making something on Etsy or something like that. But I think that's another situation, I think, where we see that. And then I'll tell you too, candidly, I've had a situation come up where a client had an employee, and this is, I guess, a COVID era sort of problem. But during the pandemic, they had an employee who was, I won't get into the details of the role, but it was a really important role with the company. And this individual, they found out after several months, this person working for them, they came to have strong suspicions that the person was moonlighting with a direct competitor at the same time. And it turns out it was true. Yeah, they confronted this person about it and they admitted it. And they said, well, look, I'm doing this job for you. And an opening came up at your competitor to do the same thing. And so I applied for and got the other job. And so I've been moonlighting, doing the same job for two companies at once. And he explained, well, I got two company laptops side by side. And I'm doing the same job. So I think, folks working from home, there's a real temptation to maybe have if not a second full-time job, some other hustle that they can do simultaneous or during their breaks or something like that to earn extra money.
That's a pretty egregious example where there's clearly a conflict of interest if you're working for two competitors at the same time.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Working from home, I think, does create different issues for employers to deal with. Amy, have you had any thoughts on that in terms of how can companies combat this type of issue, particularly in a remote environment?
Yeah, the remote environment is tough. We haven't come across it, I will say, but I think a lot of it might come down to like supervision, right? And checking in and making sure your supervisors are engaged with their subordinates. I mean, you might get some inklings if projects aren't getting done on time or people aren't where they're supposed to be or they're taking a lot of time off, but just generally being engaged with people and scheduling meetings and checking in and keeping more close tabs, I think, on the work is probably good. And making people turn on their cameras. You can see where they are. Are they at their house during work? Are they somewhere else? Like,
Right.
no one wants to turn on their cameras, but
Yeah, the no
yeah.
camera thing makes it really hard, right? It makes it hard to get anything done anyway. I think that some companies are turning to AI and turning to other forms of electronic monitoring in general for remote environments to make sure employees are working. I'm not sure that I'm a big proponent of that. I guess it depends on the job, but to me, making sure your employees are meeting your deadlines and managing them properly gets at the heart of the issue more than monitoring how many times they're hitting a certain key on a keyboard. But lots of challenges faced by not having adequate supervision of your employees in a remote environment. If someone's working in the office and they're using office supplies and office tools and they leave something for their other job on the fax machine or on the printer, it's going to be much more obvious.
Yeah. I mean, I guess people may not be as honest, but you could ask them to tell you, right? And have an obligation to report it. You may not know if they're being honest in a remote workspace, but if you ask them to sort of affirmatively tell you and have some kind of process around that, that might help with remote workers to have an idea. If people are leaving, if their shift ends at 5 and they're leaving at 3, you might have some questions. You may not know that if they're remote, but if you have a policy that asks them to report second employment, that might help too.
I'm not sure why I have so many stories around this, but a family member of mine is a manager at a really big company, and she manages a team of, gosh, I don't know, 40 or 50 people. And she found out that one of her employees during the pandemic, I think this was 2021, one of her employees had a catering gig, had a full-time sort of catering gig for lunch. And so she was apparently not saying that she was taking time off from the job that she was supposed to be doing that my relative was managing. But they found out through Facebook because she created a Facebook page and her name was associated with it. She would take people's lunch orders on Facebook and would post pictures of delivering food to people. I mean, it was like a business she operated out of her house and would like make I'm not sure what kind of food it was, but she would make food and deliver it to people and was promoting it on Facebook. And of course, she made the mistake of friending people that she worked with. And eventually, of course, it got reported. So, yeah, I think it's a very real issue out there. And I've dealt with other ones as well, but those are two that I think are the funniest that I've seen. But it is difficult in remote environment a lot of times, especially if it's a position where they've got deliverables, but they're not, for example, scheduled to be in meetings or, stuff like that, where they really have autonomy around their schedule and they're meeting whatever deadlines they have, producing the quality and quantity that they're supposed to do. It can be really challenging to know whether they're doing some other gig when they're allegedly supposed to be on the clock for us.
Evan, you hit on a point that's very similar to what actually happened in the movie, where Julie's cooking and blogging project starts to interfere with her day job and kind of comes to a head where she's making a recipe. I think it's the bouffe bourguignon, actually, which I'm sure I'm massacring the French. And it doesn't go well, and she has to make it again because someone's coming for dinner, and so she calls in sick. Let's listen to the clip.
So with the smell of burned stew still in the air, I woke up dying of stomach cramps. I called in sick.
And went back to bed for several hours. Put it in the blog in case someone in your office reads it.
Went back to bed for several hours.
By noon, I was somehow able to straighten myself up to a standing position.
What do you make?
Bought the ingredients for bouffe bourguignon all over again. Dragged myself home. And made another bouffe bourguignon. And for dessert, a raspberry Bavarian cream. By the end of the day, I felt fine. I was cooking dinner for a legend, even though I'd never really heard of her until a few months ago.
Maybe she'll offer you a book contract.
What if she does?
Well, I guess I have one question initially, which is there any benefits to allowing employees to moonlight? Should there just be an anti-moonlighting policy right off the bat, or are there circumstances where a company might want to allow employees under certain circumstances?
I think it's an interesting question. I think it brings up maybe one of the other reasons that Julie in the movie decides to moonlight, which is that she's really kind of depressed or sad or upset about her life and looking for a new direction. And there's so much, particularly in the COVID and post-COVID area, about the need for mental health and employee well-being, that if you have another outlet that's something that you like doing and it makes you feel better, it might be a reason to allow people to moonlight, as long as it's not like a situation that Evan described where you're working for a direct competitor. But if it's something that promotes your mental health, your well-being, your love of life, hopefully it makes you a more productive employee for the employer and just respects, the people are people outside of work too.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is if you have a really good employee and they're doing a great job, but they have a passion outside of work that they want to pursue, you don't necessarily want to lose that employee so that they can pursue their passion. Maybe it's a win-win for both the company and for the employee to allow them to pursue that passion while also continuing to work for you. And then to Evan's point earlier about finances, that sometimes employees may just have to have a second job because you can't pay them enough to keep them going on the one job.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think a lot of the question of whether employers can or should let employees moonlight, I think it's so individualized. It's going to depend on the employee's job, what they're doing for you, what the moonlighting gig would be. It's such an individualized assessment. I've seen a lot of companies, they have the sort of no moonlighting policy, and they'll have language, maybe in an offer letter or in a handbook or something like that says we expect or require you to devote your full working time, 9 to 5 or whatever, to the company. And so it seems like it's pretty common, but I think exceptions to that policy are certainly possible and they happen. But I think it's hard to not have that policy. For example, if it's a call center, where you've got people calling in, it's hard for people to do something different, at least during working hours. And so I think it depends. And then it could be an industry where, they're working with something that's so classified or something like that they don't want them working for a company, even though it may not be a competitive industry or something like that. I think it's just such an individualized issue.
There's also the reputational piece, right? If an employee is pursuing a passion and they're doing it in a public way, they may say something that reflects poorly on the company because they're an employee of the company, particularly if they're a higher level employee of the company. So there are guardrails that you may want to put up around that as well. In Julie's case, we don't know anything about a policy, so we'll assume that there was no policy in place. There was no requirement, we'll assume, for her to communicate ahead of time that she was doing this. and she gets caught. Let's listen to that clip.
Julie, could you come in here?
I didn't tell him, I swear.
Julie? Feeling better?
Much.
So, you burned the stew.
But that's not why I didn't come to work. I didn't come to work because I had
Stomach flu. Listen, it's a free country, but this little thing of yours on the internet, I do not want to show up in it, okay? And if you don't feel like coming into work, let me know. Somebody will want this job. We're trying to do something here.
I'm sorry.
Anyone else would fire you. A Republican would fire you. I'm not a schmuck.
So this was a really interesting clip about how her boss handled the situation when he discovered that she had called in sick and was actually doing her side gig, we'll call it, during her sick day. How do you think he handled it, and is there an opportunity maybe to do it differently?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I sort of like how he handled it.
Mhm.
Like, let her know he's reading her blog.
He was kind of nice about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm typically a fan of giving people like a chance, right, to sort of rehabilitate themselves. And, it's, I think, a little bit different when it's one time a person calling out sick when they're not really sick and, habitual lateness or not being available for work. If you're within your sick days and you're taking one off. I mean, you expect people to be sick anyway. It's probably fine to warn the person.
Would you have docked the person's vacation days? Take it as a vacation day if you found out?
Ooh, would I have done that? That's a great
It's a hard
question.
one.
It's a hard question. I think you definitely need to be careful about whether she appears to be non-unionized, just a regular sort of employee. I mean, that would be, I think, very challenging probably in like the bargaining unit space. You definitely want to like check your CBA before you start
Absolutely.
disciplining
Yeah.
or taking people's pay away. I probably would have been with Julia's boss and just the warning first. But yeah, I think assuming it's okay under your CBA and your policies, you certainly could have taken back the time and then made her take it as an unpaid day if she wasn't truly sick. Although be careful too, because some people don't actually have sick days, right? They have PTO. And so
Right.
I think you should be careful on that.
Yeah, I was
too.
going to say
Yeah.
that's another argument in favor of just having a sort of ambiguous PTO policy instead of sick days versus personal days, just for whatever reason. You can't make it in for whatever reason, then it's just a PTO day.
I'm a big proponent of PTO versus sick also, because I don't really want to get into the weeds of whether someone's truly sick. I think that's a decision that that person should be
Yeah.
making with their doctor. Or is it the person sick versus they're taking their sick kid to the doctor? I don't really want to know. Like, I think it's better that employees just have the ability to make those decisions for themselves. But it does kind of make me think about the concept of unlimited PTO and how that could be potentially more rife for abuse with a moonlighting situation because the person may take advantage of those unlimited days off to work their side gig. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good point. It seemed like for a little while that was getting a lot of talk. There was a lot of talk about the unlimited PTO. I don't know how widely that's been adopted now. I haven't seen a lot of folks or worked with a lot of folks that have that. I mean, I know of a few, but it
I have
seems like
two
it's
that just recently moved to it, so it is happening out there.
interesting.
Yeah.
That definitely presents a challenge if you've got unlimited time off.
Right.
There's definitely going to be some folks who take advantage of that, I think, and really push the envelope and see how far does that go? What limits are there on a truly unlimited PTO policy?
It definitely brings up that question. And of course, we're not giving legal advice here, but that does seem to come up often with unlimited PTO policies. When and under what circumstances can you start to crack down on employees that are clearly abusing this policy by taking excessive time off? It becomes somewhat complicated.
Yeah, it really does. I actually just thought of another person that I know that was moonlighting. This was another interesting one. I don't know why I know so many people that have dealt with these situations, but I was traveling for work somewhere and called a Lyft to take me to the airport. And my Lyft driver, he was a mortgage underwriter. I don't know what company, but he said he was a mortgage underwriter and that he just basically left his app on all day. I guess he lived somewhere around me. He came in a really nice car. I think it was like a Lexus or something like that. And he came and picked me up and we were talking. He said he leaves the app on during the day. And so if somebody flags him for a ride, he'll just kind of pause his work, go do the ride on Lyft, come home, and continues on with his mortgage underwriting gig. And so that's another one of those situations where For example, like if his boss knew that, would they say, well, no harm, no foul, or, you're getting your work done, but that was PTO time that you need to designate in the system that you took half a day off if you were spending half the day out doing Lyft rides. That's another one of those situations where there's an individualized assessment, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think the concept of time in the office or time in the virtual office is really becoming very fluid. I just read an article
Mhm.
about how 4 o'clock has become sort of the new stopping time. It's really hard to schedule meetings now for 4 or later because employees are just not staying in the office for full days, even when they are going back into the office, often in response to
Oh, yeah.
mandated in office policies that are the new wave. What a lot of times employees are doing now is they'll go in for sort of a partial day, leave in the mid afternoon, go do whatever they need to do for their personal lives, and then log back in at night. I think all three of us could probably relate to that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So whether it's childcare or it's a side gig or it's a second job or what have you, I wonder, it's something that may be tolerated slash expected when you have young kids at home, but would it be so tolerated or understood if it's because you're doing a second job from 4 to 8 and then logging in from 8 o'clock till whenever, 10 o'clock to do the first job? I wonder how employers would feel about that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
And how do employees feel, maybe, if you don't have young kids? You know what I mean? Like, is it any more appropriate for someone to be off for 4 hours to do whatever it is they're doing versus taking care of their families? And how does that affect employee morale too?
Right. I've heard that before, right? Where employees that don't have kids get really resentful that their employees that do have kids and have children responsibilities that take them out of the office at 4 or whatever every Wednesday or whatever it is. That doesn't seem very fair to them.
Yeah, I remember having those very, very early in my career when I was at another firm, another state. And I remember that there were, a couple of folks that had young kids. This was back when it was 100% in office. And I didn't even have a laptop, I had a desktop computer, 100% in office. And, a couple of folks would leave early for kid stuff. And it was always like, man, I can't walk out of here at 4 every day and just say, well, I've got to get the kids. And I didn't understand at the time that it's a very, now that I have a 3.5-year-old and 8-month-old, I get that, it's not optional. But yeah, especially your more junior employees, folks earlier in their careers and younger, don't have kids. It could definitely build some resentments if only certain folks are allowed to leave. And if they've got a hobby or, like we're talking about, a moonlighting gig, they want to go do whatever side gig they've got, then I can definitely see a very real morale issue coming up with employees around that for sure.
So, what's our takeaways for companies? What advice can we give to companies on how best to manage this issue?
I think from my perspective, it's good to have a policy that has certain rules in it around moonlighting. For example, you cannot moonlight for a competitor. I mean, I think that's a good one to spell out. There's no real
You
downside.
think you wouldn't have to say that, but apparently you
Feels
did.
pretty bright line. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think that you wouldn't need to say that, but as I've learned, you just never know. But maybe something like that. Look, you can't work for a competitor. You can't do anything that would require, for example, that could even possibly use confidential information that you have access to at our company. Stuff like that, where you're really making sure that you're protecting the assets of the company that's writing the policy, that they're looking out for their.
You can't use computer equipment
Yeah.
or other office supplies of employer number one for the job that you have with employer number two.
Exactly. Then just either you don't say anything beyond that, or you have something to the effect of any other employment that you may have, even if it's outside of working hours, needs to be reported to a supervisor or something like that. You can have language like that, because if you do run into a situation where you've got a problematic employee, you want to discipline them for it. It's interfere with their work, and you want to be able to say something like, oh, you violated, this policy or this procedure. And maybe the violation is that it requires reporting and they didn't report it, for example. I think that's, one approach.
Amy, do you have anything that you would add to that from a policy perspective or from an administering of the policy perspective?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's always helpful to have a policy and have a policy underpinning it. And then maybe, whatever it is can't conflict with your duties to the company, right? You're first and foremost need to fulfill your obligations to us. I think that's all right. And then I think in terms of implementation, it's really what we've said before too, is that it's not a one size fit all approach. It's probably not one size fits all. Even within the organization, there's going to be different positions. Like we said, call center employees are going to be different than an exempt who's got just some deliverables, at the end of the month anyway. And we otherwise allow flexibility for all sorts of things. So I think even if it's not laid out specifically in your policy, having the organization really think about, well, do I have competitors? What kind of confidential information? What kind of work would be okay? What are my expectations for employees in any given position so that you can evaluate requests for second employment, or if you just find out from Facebook or a blog post about cooking, how you can address it.
Because now you've violated the policy by not giving notice, not so much the moonlighting itself, it's the failure to communicate the fact that you're moonlighting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all exactly right. The only thing I would add to that is when you are administering the policy, even though it is a case by case analysis, and like you said, Amy, every job is different and some jobs may be more conducive, and every moonlighting side gig is different. So some side gigs may be more conducive to the job than others. You do want to keep in mind the idea of trying to be consistent so that you don't have employees in different protected categories getting upset that you said yes to one employee and then you said no to another employee. You have to have a good legitimate business reason for that no answer.
Yeah, no, that's really important.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion. So much fun. Such a fun movie to talk about. Now I'm a little hungry. I don't know about you guys.
We're all going to cook some stew.
Well, thanks so much, Amy, for joining us. And thanks always to my co-host, Evan. And thanks to our listeners. Please check out our blog, hiringtofiring.law, and subscribe to our podcast and drop us a line. Tell us what you think. Thanks so much.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.